Musical Talk, the UK's independent musical theatre podcast. And welcome to another edition of Musical Talk. I'm Thos Ribbits, and it will come as no surprise to you that I've again been thinking about what would happen if there was a typographical error in the advertising for well-known musical shows. We might get Miss Sail On, which presumably is just another name for the musical The Unsinkable Molly Brown. Well, thanks for joining us here again on Musical Talk for this second of my catch-up episodes about the wider world of musical theatre that you could have seen at this year's Edinburgh Festival Fringe in conversation with our old friend and fellow presenter Colm Malloy. Now, as I explained last time, Colm spent a long time at the Edinburgh Festival Fringe, as did I, and we saw a lot of the same shows, sometimes together and sometimes apart, but we also saw a few shows that the other one didn't. So today we're going to be carrying on that conversation where we just talk about some of the shows that we were impressed by at the Edinburgh Festival Fringe of 2023. And amongst others, you'll be hearing about On Your Bike, Jingle Street, the Grand Old Opera House, After the Act, Tony, the Tony Blair Rock Opera, and The Last Show Before We Die, the latter of which was an existential cabaret. And cabaret certainly comes into the wheelhouse of Musical Talk. It's always nice to broaden those horizons and talk about some of those things which are slightly on the edge of musical theatre in its broadest sense. But that's not all. So, why not listen in? In fact, if you got this far in, it would be foolish to give up now, wouldn't it? So it's time to staple yourself into your favourite polythene, and therefore waterproof, listening hammock, so that you can fully enjoy the entertaining linguistic terpsichore, if such a thing can be said to exist, that might, but isn't guaranteed to, follow in the following conversation. Here's me and Colm talking about more of the musicals you could have seen at the Edinburgh Festival Fringe. Musical Talk, the UK's independent musical theatre podcast. Dr. Malloy, I presume.
Dr. Ribbits, I assume.
You assume wrongly. I could never be a doctor. I'm not that bright, as I'm about to prove in our following conversation. Lovely to see you again, though, Colm. Thank you for agreeing to continue our conversation, talking about some of those shows at the Edinburgh Festival Fringe which we saw either together or apart, which we think are notable.
I had no choice in the matter.
That is true. Yeah, I am holding your children hostage. Actually, you don't have children. I'm holding your hamster hostage.
I don't have a hamster either.
Absolutely. Would you just... Oh, I must have stolen someone else's then. Goodness.
I wish them well.
Yeah, I'll pop it in a padded envelope and send it back to them. Edinburgh Festival Fringe 2023. Mm-hmm. Now, we've already established in a previous conversation that we've seen lots of shows and we said there was a great deal to commend many of them. We're going to do something similar today. We're just going to talk about some of those shows which took our fancy, which we think had either quality or something about them which was excellent and took our fancy. I think, if I may, we're going to talk about two shows that we saw together from the same team. They were On Your Bike and Jingle Street. And the thing about these two is they're from the same writing team, same production team, and On Your Bike had been the big hit of the much reduced 2021 Edinburgh Festival Fringe, which wasn't even an organised professional fringe that year. It was who can make it up to Edinburgh, which is all more power to the elbow of the people who actually managed to get up there, either as punters or as putting on shows. On Your Bike was Best Musical that year, and I think quite rightly, they obviously thought there was some potential left in it because 2021 was a very strange, tiny fringe. So they brought it up to this year, but with a brand new show, which I think tonally is very similar, and that was Jingle Street. Now, do you want very briefly to describe the plot?
What I remember of On Your Bike is two kind of Deliveroo
Style.
cyclers, between which a romance evolves. Is that correct?
Yes, that's exactly right.
And the main restaurant, food place that they frequent for their deliveries goes through a change at one point. It's by the same hands, but they rebrand themselves at one point.
It's a chicken shop. It's a cheap and cheerful fried chicken venue, and they're suffering at the hands of high street depression.
Yeah.
You know, as high streets start to collapse. It's also being outclassed by the big conglomerates because there are plenty of other fried chicken shops in the world. Names need not be mentioned. And exactly as you say, the shopkeeper, who's this affable chap, the shop is down at heel and he's sort of inherited the shop and doesn't really know what to do with it. He's an affable chap, but he's no real businessman. But he also converts to non-meat halfway through the show. And so the shop becomes a falafel shop and unexpectedly does quite well. There's a lovely line in it, by the way, where someone subverts the old winner-winner chicken dinner into winner-winner falafel dinner, which just tickled me immensely. So those are the dynamics going on. It's the relationship, exactly as you say, between the delivery people and cocking a snook at particularly global capitalism.
Yes.
Which sounds like big things. Love and capitalism. It's been done, and it will be done again. But thematically, let's bring Jingle Street into this at the same time.
Sure.
There's something not dissimilar here. There's a huge overlap of cast, I should say. But it's a sort of a satirical piece on late capitalism, again. You know, it's our central character is a fellow who writes jingles for big corporations. He's in advertising, and he's at the worst end of advertising. You know, he's not advertising buy a lovely orange from your greengrocer. He's given some truly appalling a jingle strike, which he does with gusto, trying to rebrand cigarettes positively and things like that. And he seems to have no shame or moral values whatsoever. And he sort of gets thrown together with someone who's very big in Green politics, and indeed he's trying to stand for a council as the Green candidate. And there's also a dynamic which means he has to try and stay in her purview because they wouldn't necessarily spend any time together. He's called Jingleitis, which means he can only speak in jingles, which is a very funny conceit. And the only time he's ever alleviated from the complaint he has is when he's with her. So she doesn't much like him. But of course he likes her for a reason, and then they start to fall in love. And of course it's a journey for him in particular. There's a hint, isn't there, that also before he really sold his soul to the world of advertising, that he was a songwriter beforehand.
Sure, yeah.
And indeed was more moderate in his politics. So there's some interesting stuff going on there. The two shows I thought felt like they were in the same world. I got a real sense that the council that the Green person wanted to be voted to could easily be the council where the chicken shop was to be found. And why not? Same cast to a degree, same writing team. I was tickled by both. I thought Jingle Street in particular was very strong. Once again, I liked its slightly more absurd world because, Jingleitis doesn't exist. I don't mean to disturb you there, but...
you are a doctor.
But that's a lovely absurdist conceit, and that is the dynamic that keeps the whole House of Cards standing.
Yeah.
And then there are some beautiful caricature characters. So the jingle writer's boss is an enormous character, beautifully portrayed by the same actor who had played the male delivery driver in On Your Bike, who's a sensitive character in that. So nice versatility there. But he plays this so ridiculously over the top character, but you can't help but find him funny, even though he's a terrible human being.
Sure.
There's one moment he gets dragged on in a body bag, I seem to remember.
Oh, yes, God.
But I really like both shows.
I think I preferred On Your Bike.
Oh, did you? That's interesting.
I think I connected more to the songs, and the one that sticks out for me is In Between, where the female delivery cyclist lives on the landing of her landlord's
That's right.
house. She's stuck in between the kind of top floor and the bottom floor. But also I think she feels that in between is kind of a metaphor for where she feels stuck in life, kind of thing. So I found the songs in On Your Bike stronger.
There was another one that stood out for me from On Your Bike, so I think you're right here, perhaps. It was the opening number called Regretfully, which was the two Deliveroo-style delivery people are actually trying to find better paid jobs and permanent jobs. They can't, which is why they're doing what they see as temporary employment as cyclist delivery people.
Yes.
And the song is a clever working of apology letters. You haven't got the job. With regretfully, we weren't on this occasion able to take it. So the song is quite a bitter song about their lot, using the terminology of rejection letters, but really placing heavy emphasis on the word regretfully, which they then stick into other objections they have to the way their lives are going at this moment. Oh, sorry, can I just say, there's also another song that's come to mind. There was a dating song, which was a little bit fourth wall breaking, if I remember rightly. So the two delivery people go on an early tentative date, and they're singing narratively to us about what they expected to happen and then what did happen. So that's a nice conceit. They don't do it through singing to each other to show us. They do it. A narrative song can be quite dull sometimes because actually it's tell not show. But actually, I thought this worked quite nicely because it sort of gave us the opportunity. It gave us what I would call a director's commentary on a DVD of the date scene. So it actually gave us their interpretations of it, which of course is actually quite useful because who says what they really feel on a first date?
Whereas with Jingle Street, I don't know what it was, but for me, I didn't connect to the narrative as much as you did. I know you really enjoyed it.
I did. I liked the narrative better than On Your Bike. And the reason is I think it was more absurdist, but go on.
It was more absurdist, but for me I don't think it actually pushed on those buttons enough. I think it was street smart, but actually I kind of wanted it to be taken to ludicrous proportions. Well, I mean, it kind of was, but maybe you made the distinction about his jingleitis not occurring when he was around his love interest. That was a detail that I'd forgotten, and actually I felt like his neuroses wasn't established enough.
Well, that's interesting
for me.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, don't apologise. And these are perfectly legitimate views. You slightly prefer On Your Bike, I slightly prefer Jingle Street, but I will accept. I think the score perhaps to the first one is slightly stronger, On Your Bike.
Yeah.
I agree with that because I'm finding it harder to remember the songs from Jingle Street. But I've got a very clear view of the narrative, which I enjoyed. A very clear view of the performances, which I enjoyed. And actually, I'm going to say this, I really love the layout of the venue. Well, I suppose it's a thrust, isn't it? The audience were on three sides. And the way it was laid out was basically two zebra crossings crossing each other. So we had black and white stripes. And these were used to delineate both streets because I think they were on Jingle Street, if I remember rightly, was the name of the street that they did their jingles writing on. But actually, that simple cross delineated both geography and the context of the piece, but also the emotional distances because the four principal actors sat, if you like, were based at the far ends of each end of the cross.
Sure.
And they would come in to meet each other and move out again. And actually, it sort of acted as a mapping. It was a GPS device for personal relationships, if that makes sense.
Sure.
So I thought that was terribly striking. And there's something we ought to mention, by the way, and this is just a little throwaway, but we were all delighted by the chap who was musically directing. Now, I don't know his name, unfortunately, but he was a show in himself. He was fabulous. He played the piano brilliantly, but to my eyes, also flamboyantly. There were certain flicks of the hand. There was a man at one with the music and his instrument in his own bubble almost. And it was, to me, that was a delight. It didn't pull focus from the show, and that would be bad if it were, but there was a moment that he looked like he was having a wonderful time.
Yes, I agree.
Now, moving on down the road to, a professional venue, because actually Jingle Street and On Your Bike were in the Paterhouse, the old C venue as was in Chamber Street, for people whose memories go back. But one of the big venues, but not a proper theatre. A series of... it's a university building, and I think they're lecture halls, essentially. But the Traverse Theatre is a proper theatre, and it does a lot of shows. The shows technically in the Fringe, because they're not part of the Edinburgh International Festival, but they feel slightly more professional, because they are professional shows. And we both saw two, not together as it happens, but we saw two different musicals there that we had slightly different opinions about, which I think is quite interesting. One was called The Grand Old Opera House, and one was called After the Act. Let's talk briefly about the Grand Old Opera House first, because actually that is Well, it's going to boil down much more easily, I think, because ultimately its big selling point and curiosity, and the reason I went to see it was because it was a jukebox opera. And that is an unusual thing. We're all aware of the jukebox musical now.
We are.
Whether it be a potpourri of songs from any old how, or whether it's the songs from the songbook of a particular set of songwriters. This was one step beyond that, in the sense that it was a potpourri of arias with some new opera-style songs in English to represent what happens in the latter part of the story, trapped within, or connected to, a farce, a proper farcical setup. And those are unusual things. A farce musical is a really unheard of thing. A farce musical in opera is even more so. So I was taken by the show much more than you were, I think.
Sure.
So just to give you a very quick understanding of the farce, I can't go into every nook and cranny, but it's set in a hotel that's been built on the ashes of an old opera house that burnt down. And the story is that the opera house burnt down, I think, 100 years ago in 1923. And whilst the audience it was mid-performance, whilst the audience was saved, the cast died. And so their ghosts potentially haunt the building. And indeed, we every now and then, as the story progresses, we will see a man or a woman dressed in 18th century, clothing, clearly actors from the opera, peer up through a window. There's a lovely moment when a man in a periwig and a lilac silk sort of suit appears up in the window very camply, as something very mundane is taking place in the hotel room, and then disappears again. So they pop up every now and then. The conceit of the story is it's set in this modern block hotel, and we're seeing the staff on their first day. They're the cleaners who look after the room. And the conceit, and this is how the farce works, is that the staff work and live in the building. So they work like Billy-O all day, and they basically collapse into their room at the end of the night. But each room, every night, it's a different room. Basically, any room that isn't been rent out is allocated to them. So they have to pack up every day, carry their belongings with them to clean the building, and then drop into whatever room, which means they never meet each other. And that is the thing that keeps people apart. And that's a dynamic that runs through. So there's only two sets, really, mostly. There's a corridor with doors in it, and we see customers come in and out, and the interactions between the cleaners and the customers, all of whom are weirdos and strange people and wanting mad demands, sometimes having emotional breakups. We even see an attempted suicide, not successful. And then we have this very clever conceit of all the rooms being exactly the same. There was an enormous audience laugh when the reveal of the hotel room, which presumably everyone in Edinburgh was staying at a variant of, was revealed. And then every scene that's set in a bedroom is set on this same set. It's not changed at all. It's fabulous. We see rooms being cleaned. We see performers playing their characters as guests. We see the performers who are the essential cleaners. And there's a male cleaner and there's a female cleaner who have never quite met, but they talk quite early on by accident through a door. And the rest of the story is almost about how can they find each other. And it's essentially the dynamic is the male cleaner is trying to find the female cleaner, and the female cleaner is dropping him hints because she listens to opera on cassette on a Walkman in a retro way, and she leaves him the Walkman and he finds it and he discovers a love of opera. Now there's no music in this for the first 2/3 this show, and it's an hour and a half. And then it actually comes around in the attempted suicide scene. The male cleaner has stumbled on a couple who are breaking up, elderly couple. The husband's been having an affair, and the mistress comes into the room, and the wife finds out, and then, the husband's sent off with a flea in his ear. The wife gets drunk and is threatening to throw herself out of the window. And the only way that the male cleaner can stop her doing that is by suddenly bursting into opera in Italian. He suddenly sings this aria from nowhere, and you've no hint that he's a singer anywhere through it. And it's a well-known song from opera, and it's so shocking to everyone that she brings the woman in from the window, but also it shocks the audience. And then for the rest of the piece, the frenetic nature of the show speeds up because he discovers he can sing opera. She can sing opera because she loves opera. And then suddenly opera is being sung, the ghosts turn up, they're all singing opera. Then there's a whole series of opera-style songs in English as they can start to communicate with each other. And at the same time, there's a threat to the hotel because it goes on fire, catches fire. And is it going to be a repeat? And it's a real opera sense. We all know the thing about opera is that people die at the end. It's a tragedy. And we get this moment where our cleaners finally meet and are together on the top of the building, but what they don't know is it's on fire and the door's locked, so they can't get out. And you think, oh my God, this is, this is a proper opera. We are relieved of it. I have to say, it was given a twist ending, which I think the audience really wanted. I have to say this, spoilers, the couple don't die. They are, in fact, rescued by the least expected character in the piece, who's actually the person who threw the cigarette in the bin and caused the fire in the first place. She's a no-nonsense Scots lass, an elderly cleaner. So it resolves in a way I think it needed to resolve. So a farcical ending was provided rather than an opera ending. But the thing we know about opera is opera aria are designed to represent big emotion, and all the way through the emotions are getting bigger and bigger, and are given this catalyst of the suicide scene, and then from that moment on it just helter-skelter. Everything turns right and then wrong and then right with these opera songs. And for me, I was utterly tickled by that. But I don't think you took quite so warmly to it.
It's interesting the way you describe it. It sounds more enjoyable than what I saw. So maybe it could be the day I had. All of those things you're describing I remember seeing, but for whatever reason I wasn't feeling the sense of fun in what you're describing.
Oh, well, that is interesting, because there are a number of factors in this. I can absolutely see that if you don't buy into the conceit. I love farce. Proper old Whitehall farce, as they used to be known, with Dawes and Vickers and goodness knows what, people running around without their trousers and mistaken identity. So I like all that conceit. Noises Off is the best known modern farce, and that's a lot of Dawes. Yeah, and it is terrific. I just like the fact that someone had said, we're going to do this weird thing and this weird thing, and we're going to marry them together and put them and make it work. But if you don't buy into it, or you're not feeling it, then I can also see that it could be tiresome.
Yes.
Well, that's
I
fair.
don't have much to add on it. Sorry, Thos.
And I don't think there is much more to say on that, except to say that it is pay your money and you take your chance.
Yes.
I loved it. I would happily see it again if it goes on tour. But it's curious, and you have to suspend disbelief. The business model of this hotel is so weird that the story only works within the context of this very strange conceit that you never leave the building, but you work and sleep in it. The idea that they might pop off to the shops to buy a Mars bar at lunchtime is beyond the scope of the whole story would collapse if anyone popped out for a sandwich. But once you buy into this very strange, constrained business model, which then is the context of the story, I think there's a beautiful sense of absurdity and House of Cards being built, which the music merely burnishes. It doesn't need to be an opera musical at all, actually. But when it does it in a way that opera does what it does, which doesn't fit in a farce and yet somehow does. So that's all I've got to say really on that.
Well, maybe I'll give it another go if it comes back around.
I shall be glad to accompany you. But the Traverse did another show, which we also, I say we disagreed on. We had different responses to.
Yes.
Is a better way of putting it. Now, I'm merely going to say it's a verbatim musical, which is a rare enough thing.
Yes.
There aren't that many around. London Road is the avatar. Mm-hmm. I've seen a few others. They're always interesting because of the format. And this was the same. But after the act is a very specific musical about a very specific thing and a very specific period of time. Would you care to elaborate?
Sure. Well, it's about the enacting of Section 28, which my understanding of it was a law that was passed which prevented the, quote, promotion of homosexuality within schools.
Yes.
That's the nuts and bolts of it.
Yeah, and the act is a one-liner. It's exactly to that effect.
But obviously that carries a cultural weight which then pervades into how people act in everyday life or at work, has all of these other implications.
It was a piece of repressive legislation, I think that's the way it was generally perceived, which had a much greater effect in society than just stopping speech marks the promotion of homosexuality. The hook, in historic terms, was the fact that a textbook was found in a school in East London, a council-run school, which showed it was a storybook about a child living with two male fathers, a gay couple. And it was whipped up by the press, and then this legislation came in. But of course, it didn't just stop books like that turning up in libraries. It meant teachers could not speak positively to children in school who were having trouble coming out or dealing with their sexuality, because that could be seen as breaking law. So it's one sentence, ostensibly, and I use speech marks on that, to stop certain books being made available to children was in fact a hugely repressive act. One sentence has never done so much.
Oh, sure.
Intentionally or unintentionally.
Well, and it was also going along against the backdrop of the AIDS epidemic.
Indeed, and general homophobia
well.
in society, which it's hard to remember now, but was profound. It was career destroying, potentially.
So, After the Act is a musical about, well, this is where my first quibble comes. It's about the period of time in which the act is drummed up and then legislated. It's not actually about after the act at all.
That's interesting. It's after the act's enacted rather than after the act is repealed.
Yeah, but actually a large majority of the musical is about...
to build up to it.
Yes.
You're right.
There it lies in my first issue. That's not to say that I didn't enjoy it. Breach Theatre, who wrote the show, are a theatre company that I think are really strong in their research and in the dynamism of their work. I first encountered them, I think, in about 2015. They did a show at the Battersea Arts Centre called Drill, which was all about first aid drills.
Oh, yeah.
It was kind of, on one level, a bit like informative theatre, and on another level, a bit like performance art. Really fun, not interactive, but dynamic is the word that comes to mind. So I've always enjoyed the work they produce. It's interesting because I think verbatim theatre, it's a bit like documentary theatre in a way.
It is.
You can't, the risk is you can't necessarily rely on the quality of the data that you've collected to speak for itself. There has to be an element of curation. And there's a scientific method to that, and what data do you want to present, but there's also a dramaturgical element to that. How do you want to present the information in a way that's understandable or in a way that builds up to something?
Yeah.
And what really...
that tells a documentary narrative.
Yeah.
And makes a point, presumably, or at least invites one to make a point.
And for me, I don't think After the Act did the dramaturgical work. And again, there's another danger with verbatim theatre to think that setting words to music, I'm going to say arbitrarily, is enough to create meaning. Whereas really, you have to create it in such a way, like with what London Road does. It finds a way to go, well, here is a line that has some dramatic significance. This is going to be a hook that we refer to, or that we find a way to apply meaning to other situations. Really, what I found After the Act did was create... It had its huge amount of text, and then, I'm going to be crude, but it felt like it highlighted moments of that text and said, here's a song, highlighted some other text and said, here's another song.
Set text to music without necessarily... And you said applying meaning is what you said a minute ago, and that's a really useful phrase. I'm going to agree with you, I think. There's a question, isn't there, with verbatim musicals, which is why? Why would you make a verbatim musical? Could this have been verbatim theatre, i.e. not musical? And the answer is probably yes. They had chosen to musicalise it, so why would one musicalise the text? Does that give you greater meaning? Can you apply meaning through the music? Now, the music, I think, was 1980s style synthy, perfectly pleasant. If you like that period, then it sounded evocative of that period. You could certainly listen to that and think, oh, some of these songs, this musical bedding could appear in television of the period in the 1980s. It felt very much of a period. So what it did do musically, I think, was help set the chronological period. It set it firmly in the 80s musically. But that's a fact. It was set in the 80s anyway, because this is when it happened, and these are when all the verbatim accounts are taken. I'm not sure, so I think I agree with you, that the music did much more than set it in an era. It didn't apply meaning to the lyrics, the wording.
And they weren't really songs, they were more like operatic arias. And in trying to be so faithful to the text, they didn't find a way to subvert any meaning either. The songs...
Yeah.
The songs
didn't shed light.
Well, sure, the songs were very sincere continuations of text into sung text, I found.
Yes, I enjoyed it at the time, but you and I saw it differently. We saw it in different performances.
Yeah.
And I was with a friend who's my age, and you and I are a generation apart at least.
Sure.
So I remember the 80s, and now it's odd. When people talk about nostalgia, they generally think about it positively. That actually I'm happy to remember my childhood or my teenage years or the music of the period or, a food stuff which is no longer available or whatever it is. It's a happy memory, a bittersweet memory perhaps, but a happyish one on the whole. Obviously nostalgia is, however, a broader thing. It's the ability to relive in one's head periods from our lives, more normally. I was there in the 80s. I was a teenager in the 80s. I remember all the things, more or less, featured in the selection of interviews. I remember the act going through Parliament. I remember the newspaper scandals. I remember the book in the school being discovered. I remember the press frenzy when a couple of lesbian protesters who were featured in this show managed to get into the BBC newsroom at 6 o'clock and break up the 6 o'clock news. Featuring, and they didn't mention this, by the way, I think possibly the best headline I've ever seen on a newspaper. I think it was The Sun, not a paper I much admire, but BBC newsman sits on lesbians was the headline the next day, because he'd sort of been trying to hold them down while Sue Lawley carried on reading the news. Oddly enough, that headline wasn't featured. They didn't mention. I was waiting for it to come up because they were mentoring other bits and pieces from the press coverage. So I and my friend found it incredibly evocative. So it was nostalgic in the sense of it was evocative, bringing back our teenage years, even though the things being discussed were horrendous for the most part. It was oppressive, it was unpleasant. The press frenzies of the 1980s are unsurpassed even today, I think. Very unedifying. They had more power then. And the individual stories are quite interesting, and some of those resonances about teachers and talking at school, and I remember being at school in the 80s. So there was lots of it that just took me straight back to a period of my life. Now, I must say, I was a teenager at that period, and the things that were happening only touched me obliquely. I wasn't directly affected by any of that particularly, but I just remember it. So I was taken back very firmly to the excesses of the 80s, shall we call them. And there is a kind of nostalgia in that. Even though I can see that wasn't very pleasant, and I remember it not being very pleasant, my own life at that time wasn't really touched by that. So I'm sitting there in parallel remembering my life as a teenager in the 80s and remembering all the things which are coming back from the stuff that's being portrayed, and my friend felt the same way. So we had this immediate connection with it purely because we lived through it, which of course you didn't. And I'm interested to know, shorn of nostalgia, because it couldn't have had nostalgia for you, at least in that sense. There'll be an intellectual interest in what happened in the 80s.
Yes.
But that's not quite the same thing as having lived through it and then being taken back there. So, and I would say the day I went, I would argue that most of the audience were middle-aged or older.
Okay.
And therefore it was playing, and I suspect was written for and by people who were there. I'd be stunned to find that was written by anyone in their 20s or 30s. It might have been, but it didn't feel like it. And certainly the performers playing the music on the sort of platform at the back were probably older than I was. And I guess that they were the composers. So it was evocative and interesting. And therefore those were the responses I was having. Intellectually, I think I agree with you that there was no obvious reason why it needed to be a musical, and it wasn't certain that musicalising it was applying new meaning or subverting new meaning or shedding new light on the material. Sorry.
Well, if I'm correct, I think one of the actors is the founder of Breach Theatre, so I think she's responsible for having written it, and she could conceivably be, she's a little bit older than me, but I don't know if it's...
But younger than me, therefore.
Well, sure, I'm not sure when she... Well, yeah.
Did you write it or commission it? Because there's a difference.
They will have written it. They write their own work.
Do they? That's interesting.
Breach Theatre definitely do. I'm wondering if there's a paradox in what you're saying about this sense of nostalgia, because what are the aims of a documentary? To shed light on something that we don't know anything about.
Yeah.
And so I'm not saying that it's wrong that you felt nostalgia, but what are the aims of a verbatim musical? To shed light on something that people don't know anything about, to be documentary in nature.
There's no emotion in that,
well,
so yeah,
sure,
quite.
but then so to tap into nostalgia, and I think what I said sounded like there was no curation going on, but I think the curation that was involved in the piece was to help people connect to the 80s, or to bring up things that people could relate to. I felt like that was perhaps wrong on their part.
Interesting. So you didn't connect to it. Did you connect to it intellectually? Is that what you're saying? Could you connect with it intellectually? As a historic lesson, as a documentary, because you made a very good point just there. A purpose of a documentary is not normally an emotional response; it's an intellectual response. But nostalgia is ultimately an emotional response.
Yes.
So for me, seeing the show, I had a big emotional response because of the nostalgia.
Yes.
And my connection with the text being offered up to us, but because so much of it reminded me of it happening, but not the individual's dialogue and testimonies from witnesses, but the point to point of the story, I just remembered. So it's very difficult for me to disconnect the emotional responses of nostalgia with the documentary stuff coming forward. What was new to me was the testimony, and some of it was very touching, very moving, although it stuck. Well, I found it was. There was a teacher who didn't feel that she could talk to her pupil who came to her because she was struggling with her own sexuality, because she was worried about breaking the law. I found very touching. But it's not a new story.
I actually struggled with those moments.
Oh, did you?
There was the teacher who was in a gay bar and bumped into her student.
Yes.
And then the week after, the student brought it up, and the character mentions she had an opportunity to say something, but instead she said, "We're never talking about this, don't ever bring this up again." And I know that the effect, or the intended effect, was to make me go, "Oh, isn't this horrible that this legislation makes people act in ways they don't intend to." But I don't know whether it's a dramaturgical issue, because these testimonies are played by only a cast of 4, and they flick up and then they're gone and this character is never mentioned again. I really struggled to believe it. I almost didn't buy it.
You mean it de-documentaryized it?
Yeah.
That's a really interesting concept. So it worked against its ambitions in some sense.
For me it did.
Yeah, well, I don't disagree with you.
And I think this was... Am I right in thinking the show... all of the show's merits, it ends with a reference to cruising?
Well, I wanted to mention this. And
it just... Again, I just felt it completely undermined itself.
It did. It wasn't even just cruising. It was... so such narrative beats as... You mentioned the word curation, so let's call it that. The curation of the story, in terms of the points, are... We get to see the context in Britain and the press whipping up a situation which then results in the act. Then we see how the act actually affects people. Mm-hmm. And then we sort of end up in a rally, I think it is, in Manchester, which is marking the repeal, I think it is.
Yeah.
Some years later, 2003, something like that.
Sure.
Anyway, it's a good chunk of time after the act had been in place for a while. And the testimony we get is of a young person, presumably therefore someone who'd been at school during the period the act was in place, who was gay, and the sense of liberation they felt at being at this rally where they were finally connecting and networking with other gay people at the point that the act was being repealed. But, and you're quite right, it finishes off with him in a gents' lavatory importuning, to use the old-fashioned phrase. Basically, it's sex in a public lavatory, which is not, in my view, a celebratory way of ending that story. It's rather sordid, I have to say it. And the act wasn't making that illegal, so that still is illegal.
But I think it really undermines all of the testimonies that come before it as well.
Well, it does. It's I use the word sordid, and here's a phrase, it left a bad taste in the mouth, because I think what was being suggested was sexual freedom was able to reassert itself as a result of the repeal of the Act. I guess that's, there was a sexual aspect to this, not the intellectual repression, not only the intellectual repression of homosexuality. If that's the purpose, I understand it intellectually, I think it's a very poor thing, because actually the Act isn't about repressing sexual activity. It's actually much more about the concept of repressing homosexuality in its general sense, and as I say, the Act had nothing to say about the sexual act, and the sexual act remains, at the time of the repeal, it made no difference on... People were still cruising in lavatories and elsewhere throughout the period of the Section 28, because it wasn't about that. So it's a very odd thing to celebrate if that's what it's trying to do. But it didn't feel to me like it was a celebration. The rally could have been. So, I think you and I are on exactly the same page. Why was that the full stop of this story? Well, there we are. I'm not sure there's much more to say about After the Act. Certainly an interesting idea. For me, it still falls down at the first position, that why is this a musical? It could have been a piece of verbatim theatre and possibly worked better. I don't think it was justified as a musical, and it didn't quite carry it off. But there's also this thing that nostalgia can never be underestimated, and I suspect a hell of a lot of people in the audience I was in with enjoyed it because they were enjoying the nostalgia.
We're not in short supply of musicals or plays even about the AIDS epidemic.
No, true.
I know your feelings on Angels in America, but Angels in America is a play that I happen to really like, and
quite reasonable.
It documents, to use a verb that we're going with, a similar period of time, albeit in a different country.
Yeah.
And yet I find that very emotive, and I do respond to what's going on, despite the fact it's all completely fabricated. It's based on a period of time, but it's fantastical in many elements. So
is that the structure of the fact that it's got characters in it that you feel sympathy for, whereas actually in a verbatim theatre or verbatim musical piece, it's harder to relate emotionally to a character. You may be able to relate to the incident, as I did with the school teacher, not being able to support the student who was in need. But that is an incident. That I didn't know the teacher character. I didn't, and they didn't turn up again. It's pointillism. It's Georges Seurat and Sunday in the Park with George, a musical, verbatim musical. It's point and a point and a point and a point, and you're trying to make it into a picture with the points.
Yes.
But you have to have a pretty good idea of what the picture is to make those points mean that together. And actually, this didn't feel quite focused enough to get the picture out of its pinheads.
Yes, I think that's right. So yeah, and I'm always very wary of nostalgia as an idea, because it doesn't feel like deserved emotion.
It's entirely in the audience's hands.
Yes.
Yeah, because the nostalgia I will feel is for my own experiences, and my friend will have had similar experiences but not the same experiences, so his nostalgia will be slightly different for the same period. So it's nothing to do with the drama or the piece in front of us. The piece is merely evoking a period, and then we're responding to the evocation, not to the text.
It's very segregating. I mean, now it requires the audience to be of a specific demographic in order to connect to the piece.
And I think that's a very, very fair point. It was so interesting to hear what you had to say as someone who didn't have that nostalgic connection with it. And on the whole, you found it not to work. When I intellectually analyse it, I agree with you. But I had this enormous emotional response to it, but that emotional response was my experiences from the 1980s.
Yes.
And I would have got the same thing if I had sat in an empty auditorium and someone had played, now that's what I call music hits compilation number 5 from 1984.
Yes.
Or something.
Good point.
And just very briefly, because I don't think it's worth talking about in any great depth, not because it's bad, but there's a question about worth. There's a show called Tony the Rock Opera, or Tony the Blair Rock Opera. It is what it says on the tin. It's a very funny telling of the career of Tony Blair as Prime Minister, written by Harry Hill, with the same composer that he used for I Can't Sing, which I thought was terribly accomplished. So it's got a good score, it's very funnily written. But here's my question. Tony Blair became Prime Minister in 1997 and stopped being Prime Minister in 10 years later.
Yeah.
That's now a good while away. You know, we're talking at least 15, 16 years away. Which in political terms has been, you know, we've had 27 Prime Ministers, some of whom have lasted nearly a week since then. You know, it's been a tumultuous period since he was around. Obviously there's the Iraq War and the controversy relating to that in terms of British politics, but that now seems like very old history to me. I was there. No, of course you were there as well, although you were very young.
Yeah.
I don't understand why a musical about Tony Blair is now out here in 2023, and it's on national tour. Why that's a thing. I don't understand why that's a thing. It's very good. I enjoyed it, but it felt like watching, you know, it was as relevant to me as watching a musical about Stanley Baldwin from the 30s. You know, I enjoyed it. I did remember the things, because I can remember it all happening, and it's terribly accomplished, but generationally, it's not relevant. It can only be nostalgic. Well, it's also a send-up. It also fails briefly, I should say, a little bit in Act 2, because the Act 2 is much more about the Iraq War situation and the controversy, particularly in Britain, about that. But he's not in it much. It's actually, what we get is George W. Bush and Donald Rumsfeld, I think it is. So actually, and they even make a reference to the fact, or, you know, when he comes on again, he says, I haven't been in it much, have I? And you just think, well, no, you haven't actually, and this is your musical. So even within its own context, it sort of fails to put Tony Blair on trial. It's the end of his life, and he's sort of being judged by St. Peter, if you like. Is that kind of, it's a retrospective, was this man good or bad? But actually, as the principal, you know, the principal controversy of his career, he's not featured in, at least in the way it's portrayed on stage, is a curious choice. But I just wondered if you had a view from your, you know, we have a generational difference.
We do.
What does, if someone said, do you want to come and see a musical about Tony Blair, even if it's funny and well written, what's the draw? Would it have a draw for you?
I'd see it out of curiosity, but it sounds like really what makes theatre tick is there a strong character? What's their situation, and what do they go through?
Yeah.
Because, again, if all you're relying on as a writer is the audience's nostalgia, you're then leaving...
Or at least remembrances.
You're leaving a lot of people out. And all it requires you to do is to add in a couple of references that people who were conscious at the time get. To go, oh, this is brilliant.
So, yeah.
This reminds me... Oh, it's so realistic.
Yeah,
No, I'm slipping into that accent, sorry. but
why not? Yeah.
But that isn't to say that there aren't things about historical characters. I know I always cling to Sondheim for references, but Assassins is a musical about a specific group of people, but the way in which it's written doesn't rely on the nostalgia of the audience necessarily to find a way in. So there would be a way to do a Tony Blair musical, but it wouldn't be the obvious way. You have to care about your character. I'm sorry to say, you do have to care about them, and you can't just expect them to exist in the vacuum that you've created, full of your little references to
what happened. Yeah. Well, I agree with that entirely, because funny enough, there was a spate of Tony Blair musicals when I first started covering musicals for Musical Talk for the Fringe, because I started going in 2007.
Sure.
And so in 2007, 2008, 2009, there were musicals about Tony Blair because he was the just gone Prime Minister.
The Blair Witch Project.
Well, if you like, but well, I remember there was the Tony Blair musical, and then there was Tony the Blair musical, and then there was all these variants.
Tony Blur, the
probably
Blair musical.
There was a period where there were 3 different Tony Blair musicals at the same time at one Edinburgh Fringe, and I think it was 2008. Can't remember, but one was by James Lark, which I liked a very great deal, and we covered here on Musical Talk. But the point about that was that's a perfectly legitimate thing because he just stopped being Prime Minister, so it was legitimate to do a review of his career, if you like. 15 years later, Tony Blair is the only Prime Minister like Margaret Thatcher that people still have sort of visceral feelings about. And it's not for me to judge that, but you can't go into a show about Tony Blair and expect to have the character unfold in front of you because of the actions of the writer and the actor. You go in with your, I'm going to impose my opinion of what Tony Blair is or was on the actor playing Tony Blair. And so it can only be a series of caricatures onto which we project. So it's not just nostalgia, it's projection in this case.
Unless you're showing us something new, or
which they didn't.
Well, yeah, or reinterpreting it.
But I think you need more distance to do that. I think you're starting to get into the period, maybe not even yet, with Margaret Thatcher, because she's just 10, 15 years before that. You could do it with Harold Wilson. Harold Wilson's been dead a long time, but he was never quite as controversial. But you could do that with Harold Wilson because he's far enough away now. Harold Wilson stopped being Prime Minister when I was a 5-year-old, so anyone who's 10 years older than me and younger won't really remember Harold Wilson, and you're already getting to 70 or so.
Sure.
He does, of course, turn up in Made in Dagenham, but it isn't about him.
Or what you do is there's a play by Alfred Jarry called King Ubu.
God, I've heard of this.
I can't remember when it was written, like late 1800s, early 1900s. And a few years ago there was a play called Ubu Trump, in which they had reimagined the play, but it was about Trump, because in King Ubu he's this kind of tyrannical being who does things without no rhyme or reason, really, which I guess could be a way of describing how Trump served his presidency. So there are those kind of parallels you can draw, but
But it was done when Mr. Trump was actually president, so there was a kind of parallel to be drawn.
Sure.
Yeah.
But I'm really sceptical of relying on nostalgia to get an audience through a piece.
Yeah.
There's an opera by John Adams called Nixon in China, which I assume is about Nixon being in China. But I don't think...
If it isn't, you've been sold a pup.
But I don't think it's necessarily relying on this, I remember when that was going on. I think it's... On one level, it's kind of quite documentary in that it's showing us historically what went on, but it's probably offering us a psychological insight that we don't have.
Absolutely. And also, it's about an incident, not a career.
That's very true.
It's really boiling it down to a thing, and you can get into the detail there. And no one, except the closest diplomats, will know what happens in relations, at summits, behind and in front of the cameras, as it were. Whereas the Tony Blair years are so broad anyway, they're boiling it down to 2 or 3 things regardless, which doesn't do anyone justice. Same with Margaret Thatcher. Margaret Thatcher is bigger than the coal strikes. Whatever you think of her, there's 10 years of being Prime Minister there, and a lot of things happened in that 10 years. Same for Tony Blair. Same for any Prime Minister, actually, with the exception, even Liz Truss, who was in for 49 days, the country was in a very different state at the end of her 49 days than it was at the beginning, partly because of her actions and partly because we lost the head of state when the Queen passed. Even in 49 days, your entire world could change.
Yeah, that's a very good point. There is this, I feel like this habit of, if there is something, a piece based on a living or real or recent historical character, to give an overview, which is really helpful theatrically. I agree.
The problem is it's join the dots. It's point to point, but the problem is the points can't be detailed enough.
The way you would do it, and I'm not necessarily saying I'd want to see this, I'm sure there would be someone I would want to see it about. If you're going to do a whole piece about Tony Blair, you'd make it 5 hours long, and you'd make it like there are reasons why things can be, sure, brevity is nice, but War and Peace deserves to be the length that it is. Proust's, in whatever it's called, deserves to be as long as it is, because there's an investment in a way. If you want to do a musical about the 10 years of Tony Blair, I don't know, you make it 10 hours long or something.
Absolutely, I agree with you. You've got to do it justice. It's only once people start disappearing from memory, actually, again, that you can go back to the broad brush. Because I saw a musical about Andrew Carnegie called The Star-Spangled Scotchman. It's one of the reasons I remember it, because it's got this really complicated title. It was a virtual musical, and we reviewed it, I think, for the 2021 Edinburgh Fringe, because it was part of the Edinburgh Fringe virtual offering. And it was perfectly fine, but that's because I knew nothing about Andrew Carnegie. And now I know something about Andrew Carnegie, and you could get it into a 2-act, 2-hour show. I haven't got any of the detail of his life, but it was point to point. But actually, because I knew none of the points, that meant something. But I know all the points of Tony Blair because I lived through it. You know, it's
yes. Or, sorry, this is a slight tangent, but there's a musical called A 24-Decade History of, I think it's American music, or it might just be music. I think it's American music. And it's a 24-hour piece, and each hour is dedicated to a decade of music, starting from 240 years ago.
So, that's even before America becomes independent.
I think that's the kind of that's the reason why it's 240, because it's pre-independence and then it's American history through music.
Well, good, but that would take quite a. Presumably, you take it in bite sizes. You don't sit there for 24 hours.
Well, no, it was done with the Barbican a few years ago over 4 nights, and then I think afterwards they did a 24-hour performance. It's a one-man show. Good
luck to whoever does that. Well, brilliant in a way, though. That's fabulous.
But I'm just again thinking about what are the demands of the subject you've chosen. That's also a question that I don't think is asked sometimes.
I agree with you. I mean, it's interesting. I expected us to be talking about Tony Blair literally for 5 minutes, but actually structurally we've come up with quite a lot of interesting issues.
Yeah.
I should say that once you've parked your brain...
Oh, I'm sure it's great.
It was great fun. It was great fun, and the performances were beautiful, and it felt like a Harry Hill musical, and the score was enjoyable. So... You know, you can have worse nights in the evening than seeing Tony the Blair Rock musical by some margin. But does it deserve to exist? On that criterion, yes, but meaningfully, no. Now, we were talking just a minute or so ago about how shows about real people sort of start off being relevant because the person's just stopped doing whatever it is they do. They become irrelevant for a generation or two whilst they're still alive, but it's almost impossible to change anyone's perceptions of them, and then they become valuable again as time goes on. So we're talking generations have to pass to make these kind of shows have worth again. And of course, as generations pass, the audience passes too. Ironically, you saw a show that almost sums this up in terms of its title.
Yes, and probably the best show I saw at the Edinburgh Fringe.
Excellent. What was it called?
It was called The Last Show Before We Die. And it was written by a duo whose work I've seen before. I first saw them in 2017. They wrote a show called Hotter, and their work is verbatim. So they, the way Hotter worked was they asked women of various ages, what being hot means to them, and the various meanings of the word hot. Literally warm, or the kind of sexual connotations behind that.
Yeah.
And rather like with After the Act performing, gosh, how can I even explain this? You can keep this in, by the way. Rather than them acting out the testimonies they'd been told, they lip-synced the testimonies. So from the very beginning, the methods and mediums they use to get these stories across are they sing, they dance. There are elements of performance art.
But when you say lip sync, the first thing I'm interrupting you rudely. I'm sorry, but when you say lip sync, I also think of the tradition of drag.
Sure,
where there's a huge amount of lip syncing.
And their names were Mary Potter and Elle Higgins, but their brand or their theatre company is called Hotter Project. It's named after their first show, Hotter. That they used to be in a couple, but there's definitely a kind of queering and queer nature to their work. So the lip syncing feels genuine in that sense. But they lip sync to recordings we hear of the interviews they've conducted, and there's always a kind of theme that runs through. Anyway, I'm describing the show that I'm not talking about.
No, but you're setting up the dynamic of how they work.
Sure. So they did that show, and then a couple of years ago they did a show called Fitter, in which they asked men of various ages what it means to be fit.
They love comparatives.
Sure.
Yes.
And then that became a double bill that they did. And then this year they had their show called The Last Show Before We Die.
Deader.
Yeah. And this was also had verbatim elements. They asked people who included palliative care doctors, I think they asked school children, they asked people with terminal illnesses what it means to die, or what that...
The prospect of dying.
Sure. Or actually specifically it was endings. What do endings mean to you? The way they framed the show was that they were thinking that this might be the last show they do together, because they've been through a lot as both a couple, as flatmates, as friends, and they're realising that they're now at a point in their life where they might not live together. They're growing up in a way. Life is changing, and so they're seeing this as a bit like an end. So they've written a show about that. And what I love about their shows, or I've always loved, is the sense of playfulness and the sense of fun, but also surprise. So it was done at the Roundabout Summer Hall, which is a Payne's Plough venue. It's a bit like a circus tent.
Indeed, it's where Kathy and Stella solve a murder. Well, last year it was. They've now gone on to the other Bailey in George Square, which is a bigger venue again. But yeah, it was in the Round Marquee in Summer Hall last year. It's a great venue, by the way.
Really good venue. And you walk in, and the two of them are lying there, unconscious it seems, completely naked except for tights that they're wearing. So already you're stepping into a kind of where am I? The show starts, and I am giving it away, but just because I really enjoyed it, and I think it sets up the show perfectly. And you kind of have this drum and bass music, and they start convulsing violently for about 5-10 minutes, and you're kind of going, okay, we'll watch this for a little bit.
Isn't this Edinburgh?
There's they release a party popper at one point as well, and then they've got the it's like a kazoo, but it's the thing that the windy.
Oh, the razzer.
Yes. Yeah. Again, all of this sense of fun and play, and you think, okay, how much more of this kind of convulsing can I tolerate? And then it stops, and then they kind of announce, we're alive, we've been reborn, and they talk about, this was our resurrection, and now we're going to talk about how we're going to die, and then they set up the premise of the show. And
physical theatre involvement quite high in this, by the sound of it. Yeah,
sure. But throughout that, again, they just set up elements of play. It takes on a meta element. One of the characters, one of the duo, decides that they don't want to do the show anymore. They're finding it hard. They leave the stage. And again, it has this element of, is this real? Is this not real? And so the other actor has to carry on by themselves. They enact daily routines, but there's an element of grotesqueness to that, so it's a bit like a montage. There's music going on, they're running around the space, they're getting ready for work, one of them is brushing their teeth, and then they swill their mouth with water, and then they spit back into the cup, pass it to another person who then drinks it. So disgusting in that sense. With all of the kind of water and toothpaste brine in their mouth, they spill it all over their face. They make tea for each other, but they rip the tea bag over and they pour the tea leaves into their mouths. So it feels very... the thing I said after seeing it was so much of theatre is about suspending your disbelief. But with this show, they blur the boundary of reality and theatre by actually doing real things, if that makes sense.
Yes.
They're not acting...
But off-kilter.
Sure. They're not actually acting out... drinking toothpaste brine. They are actually doing it. So then I think it gives them ammo to then confront the subject of the piece, which is endings and dying.
It sounds quite sensory.
Sure, that's a way of thinking about it. There are so many elements to it. I mean, at one point, one of the actors breaks into She Sings Maybe This Time from Cabaret, and then towards the end of the piece, they have balls of string which they connect from one audience member to another, and so we're all holding this one piece of string, and then they step into the arena and they both read out letters that they've written to each other about what ending would mean to their relationship. They both cry, which is quite moving. It could conceivably be quite, manipulative.
Yes.
They probably do it every night. I don't know, but it is really touching. The things that they say, the audience are very reactive to it because I think they give the audience leverage to respond, and then the strings that we're all holding are cut with scissors, and then I'm explaining the whole piece. Really, what I mean to say is. They bring all of these things together in a messy but coherent and fun and playful way, and they got a really unfair 2-star review in the stage, and the review described all of the things that I've just described but framed it negatively. I think it was really, really fun.
But that takes us full circle back to the Grand Ole Opera House. Whereas you were kind enough to say that the way I described the things you remember yourself seeing sounded much more joyful to me than they did to you.
Sure.
And actually, that goes to show the good theatre is in the eye of the beholder, and the ear of the beholder, and in the heart and the brain of the beholder.
Sure.
So this is another good example. The stage reviewer obviously thought this is a bit much, self-indulgent or manipulative or whatever it was, whereas you really bought into it, and I can hear the enthusiasm in your voice. I don't know if it's the kind of show I'd want to see, I must say.
I'd be very intrigued if you saw it, because it doesn't feel... it again pushes that boundary, because you are seeing two real people on stage. They're not acting as characters. They are being themselves, or
they're playing actors who are playing themselves.
That's
there's
also
always
true
as well. There's that,
but they embraced the mistakes that happened. They had to ask for lines a couple of times. They had to help each other out because they couldn't remember which part of the show. I can completely see it as that being things that they constructed, as saying, we need to make it look like I've forgotten a line here, kind of thing.
Yeah.
But again, it's like good magic, or it's like good... It's like Darren Brown, everything is calculated. Even the mistakes that he creates are calculated.
Of course, it's meticulous, isn't it, in his
Sure. And it is manipulative, but I don't necessarily... I don't like knowing I'm being manipulated.
But if you are manipulated and you don't know it, then it's a very successful thing to have done.
Course.
And theatre often is that. This is really interesting. It sounds a very different kind of show to the kind of show I would normally go and see. But it falls into musical theatre because there obviously are songs and music soundscapes and music interfuses. I think you said before we even started talking that it's a kind of it's a hodgepodge in its oddness.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Colm. It's been really interesting. I just briefly want to finish with two shows which were on the edge of being musical theatre, like yours, to a degree. One was called, and this is a fabulous title, The Brief Life and Mysterious Death of Boris III, King of Bulgaria. And this takes us back to that idea about how do you tell the story of the life of someone who, in this case, isn't very well known within Britain for obvious reasons, but he was the king of Bulgaria in the Second World War. And basically backed the Nazis over the Allies, and then regretted it, particularly when Nazi Germany started to try and impose Nazi law in Bulgaria, particularly the persecution of the Jews and others. And how he used his personal power as far as he was able to protect people. And so it's a musical, but it's a jukebox musical in the sense of the songs are actually all from the Bulgarian folk repertory.
Oh, great.
And in most cases, not in English. Whilst the play is absolutely in English and it was a British cast, but it was an amazing show and opened up a whole episode that I wasn't aware of. And he dies in mysterious circumstances shortly after meeting Hitler, because Hitler is cross that he's being thwarted. It's very strongly hinted that this is an unnatural ending.
Yep.
And it was quite a powerful piece. It was also terribly entertaining, and the chap playing Boris III in particular was remarkable. Played that character to perfection. A man really struggling with a very difficult situation to try and do the best in a situation that is unwinnable, really. How do you play a terrible hand of cards? And then another show, once again, not quite a musical, but a show with music, was called Bojangles, Dracula in Space.
Okay.
Now, Bojangles are a group of contemporary string quartet.
Oh,
And I
okay.
use the word contemporary because they try to avoid turning up in dinner suits and playing like a chamber piece.
Sure.
So they're all in boiler suits in this, and they add narratives to their story. So basically, they played bits of classical music to create atmosphere in a modern telling of the Dracula story set in space.
Okay.
And I'll leave it to you to work out how that works. But it was funny. They play instruments. The woman who had, I think it was a cello, had a kind of support thing where the cello was raised up, so it was more or less parallel to the ground when she played it, and she played it in front of herself.
Oh.
So they're not afraid to experiment. And you'll have seen this more common, an electric violin or viola, which is just the fretboard with the strings,
Yeah.
and no barrel, as it were, because he doesn't need one if it's amplified, telling a story with great humour about the Dracula story by Bram Stoker. It was, I say, not absolutely a musical,
Yeah.
but very much in the world of musicals. It didn't have any lyrics per se, but musicalised theatre. And so it just goes to show that pretty much everything is available in Edinburgh if you look for it, even within the limits of musical theatre, which we've explored today.
We sure have.
Colm, always good. I'm sure we could talk for hours about Edinburgh this year, but we can't forever.
No.
We have to eat and do other things occasionally.
And
But-
go next year as well.
Yeah, and indeed go next year. So we have to stop talking before the end of July next year.
Yes.
And so to give you some sense of that, let's stop now and see what it would feel like. So, Colm, genuinely good to talk to you. Thank you so much, and I look forward to speaking to you again soon.
Thank you for taking me on this Highland Serenade.
Musical Talk. And there we are. That was Colm Malloy and me in conversation, having another roundup conversation about the musicals that you could have seen at this year's Edinburgh Festival Fringe. There were so many more. And I'm delighted to say that over the next few weeks and months, you'll now be able to hear some of the in-depth conversations I had with the creators and the performers and the people behind and in front of some of the shows. Not just the ones we've already spoken about, but some that we haven't. And it's always interesting, and indeed an honour, to get to hear how these shows were created and put on stage. I do hope that if you didn't get to the Edinburgh Festival Fringe this year, you do feel that you've had a sort of sense of what there was on offer. And if you're a lover of musical theatre, and goodness, if you've got this far into the episode and you're not, then you've done terribly well. I hope that you've found the recent roundup episodes of The Fringe to be an enjoyable experience. And as I say, do join us again over the next few weeks and months for more dedicated episodes about specific shows. But for the time being, it would be remiss of me if I didn't release you into the wilderness. Fly, my beauties, fly. And I'm going to do that by saying the magic word. Not, as you might have thought, Oscar Paloozalam, which fans of Whizbit will fully understand, but indeed something quite different, but very familiar. Let's try it. Here I go. Goodbye. And it seems to be working, and that's magic. This episode of Musical Talk presented by Thos Ribbits and Colm Malloy. Edited by Thos Ribbits. Copyright Musical Talk 2023. To find out more about the world of Musical Talk and listen to past episodes, go along to our website www.musicaltalk.co.uk or subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and follow us on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter. And if you want to follow me on Twitter, you can at MusicalTalkThos. One was called The Grand Old Opera House, and one was called Against the Act,
After the act.
and one was called After the Act.